Right. What I would say is that if we're going to have an independent, healthy democracy, it has to be based on fact, not on fake news as at the moment. And actually, I see the National Audit Office as one of the key bodies that provides reliable facts. And it basically is also independent. And I actually looked into a little bit of history of the National Audit Office, mainly because having left The Guardian in 2009, I still have a great connection with the, believe it or not, the obituaries department, who basically want to make sure that they're kept up to date and have in advance profiles of leading civil servants and public figures. And as a result of this, I have recently had a big chat, and this is really good news for auditors generals when one thinks of the age of them, with Sir Gordon Downey, who's still a sprightly 91-year-old, and Sir John Bourne, another former auditor general who is 84. And basically it was a nice conversation, despite me approaching them saying, actually, we're planning your obituary and we need to have a really good piece on it. And in fact, actually, I agree with Sir Gordon when he said, basically, I hope this isn't used for the next decade. And I said, quite right. But what is fascinating about audit office, and I don't know whether it's across the whole of Europe, is that the independence of the NAO is very, very precious in the sense that, from what I gather, it basically, some departments, some audit things are still branches of the Treasury. The Treasury, I frankly often think, is a whole hand full of people who avoid spending money at any cost and tend to be rather strict about things. And actually the Audit Office, I found by talking to them, I'd like to mention this, is it came about in 1983-84 by a mixture of luck and a lot of really good circumstances. Originally it was the Exchequer and Audit Department stuck in various offices and ended up with basically still being controlled by the Treasury. But a very, very flamboyant politician called St John Stevens, Lord St John Stevens, combined with, I think, the then chair of the Public Accounts Committee. And it wasn't a government bill, it was an independent bill, and they set it up. And luckily, before the Treasury could get its hands on it, Lady Thatcher called a general election, and it got caught up in what's known as the wash-up, when just like now, Parliament's coming to an end. And talking to both of them, the other really clever, you're a really canny lot, you auditors, because the building we're in, I hadn't realised that I think it was Sir Gordon Downey and his predecessor. This building is free. It's in the centre of London. It pays no rent except for one peppercorn. And it's guaranteed for 150 years. And as we're off the record, because someone said, don't broadcast this too much, or Network Rail, who gave this away probably in a contract that the PAC would have criticised at the time, has actually preserved it. So I think this is really important. The other really important thing for the independence of the National Audit Office and the role of the Public Accounts Committee, which predates them, is that you're accountable to Parliament, not government. And this is really important, particularly in these days when people are starting to create Parliament versus people things and so on, because it's really important that you're totally independent of the executive, and that is extremely healthy. In other words, no one can go and lean on Meg from the government and say, oh, I'm not having that report out, or I'm not having this, that and the other. And that has been really good. The other development was when I got onto The Guardian in 1976, I had 10 years covering various specialisms. I had an idea of a bit of the health service, of local government, of transport, and quite a range of things on Whitehall. And the editor sent me down to Parliament in what was then a unique, it was Peter Preston's idea, actually, the late editor of The Guardian, to say everyone else in this Parliament seems to work in this, it was very secretive lobby system, and spent all their time hunting as a pack, chasing politicians for elections. Said, I don't want you to do that. I want you to go down and I want you to start either investigating the MPs, but also investigate Whitehall, but be based in Westminster, because Westminster gets far more information. And it was also at a time where if you, I think any senior civil servant probably is not supposed to speak to you. And there was a very famous thing when a rival paper, the Sunday Times, set up a Whitehall correspondent and no one talked to them because Whitehall wasn't supposed to talk to the press. This gives you how outdated it was. And when I was hunting around, I suddenly realised if I wanted to look at Whitehall, what better organisation than the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee? Because they were producing reports all the time. Every time there was a major sort of privatisation under Thatcher, there was a report. And then I got involved and I nearly got thrown out of Parliament, because what happened was I followed one particular privatisation, which was when the Ailing Rover Group, because the British, until foreign countries come here, we are hopeless at building cars unless they're run by the Japanese or someone else. But the British Leyland was a complete mess. And it was given away to BAE Systems, or the predecessor, British Aerospace, took it over. And the National Audit Office produced a report which basically said it wasn't very good, and I wrote it up. I mean, it was quite critical. But there was one line in it that said there was a confidential memorandum that's been given to MPs. And I ran this thing, just as straightforward. And the next day, I got a telephone call from someone who I'm still not going to tell you, even though it's 1988 it happened, because the person is still alive, and said, you should see what the Auditor General has written in this memo. And it was Auditor General was very good, a 4-page, journalists would be pleased with this, a 4-page succinct memo disclosing, and the Public Accounts Committee, and I'm sure Meg wouldn't go along with it now, had agreed to keep it secret at the time, that actually all the figures in this Wretched report weren't quite true, because 33 million quid then at the time had actually been given in what we then called the Rover Sweetness, which basically was a story of basically to get British Aerospace to take over this heap of junk, this British Leyland. They actually paid for extra things, but they kept it secret, like buying all the shares. They were also promised to put it into the space programme, but BAE. And all this was hidden from the public, and we ran this. And it was fascinating. There was a huge row. And basically, the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee went to the Privileges Committee and Standards Committee and said, get rid of this journalist and this editor. How dare they publish this when we haven't decided, and so on. And we were hauled before all the committee. And again, I found how secretive and crafty Parliament is. The clerk to the committee ran the deputy editor of the paper before it appeared and said, are you going to disclose who told you this? And the deputy editor said, no, there's no way are we going to disclose this. Oh, well, thank you very much. And then when the hearing went, it went 45 minutes. It was a private hearing, not a public hearing. They actually asked us every which way question, except who disclosed it. And it was a fascinating committee. It had Tony Benn on one side and also some right-wing Conservatives on the other. And then they produced a report which actually said that we shouldn't have done this. And I was expecting, and a lot of my colleagues said, you'll be thrown out of Parliament for this because you breached things. And I wasn't. And then I had a lunch with her. I said, well, why not? Why wasn't I thrown out? She said, well, actually, it's partly because Parliament's rather arcane institutions. There were 3 things they could do to you. One, they still had a very ancient power to stick you down on the Thames and put you in the Tower of London. But they realised that might end up as the wrong tourist attraction for people and draw attention to it. Second one, they said, we've got 2 cells under Big Ben, they can put you in there, but that would look a bit bad. And they said, well, they had looked at the third one, which was basically, we'll take it to the court, ask the courts to prosecute him and put him in Wormwood Scrubs. But it was just at the time when there'd been a huge row with trade unionists and they'd had to release them. And someone said, well, actually, if we do all this, this guy's he's been put in prison for telling the public that they were wasting money in keeping it secret. And they actually decided to do nothing. The other extraordinary thing happened, that's why I got to know Sir John Moore. He in the Financial Times basically said it was the most disgraceful thing he had heard and was very critical. And I sort of bumped into him rather gingerly, thinking, well, he's going to be tearing me apart. And instead of that, he said, well, it's great, he said. I said, why? He said, well, no one had heard of the National Audit Office until you caused all this trouble. And now everybody thinks the National Audit Office is quite amazing. It tells people about money that's been misallocated and other things. And actually, ever since then, for a period, I think I can say so, we arranged 2 lunches a year. One I paid for, and one he did. And he didn't leak reports, but what he did do was steer me to issues that the NAO was going to look at and said, you go off on yourself and be prepared for this, that and the other to come out. And it was really helpful in that way. And it was a sort of, and I'm still obviously still in touch with him today. Now, what I was going to say actually is if I now jump quite away, because I was on the Guardian to 2009, I then went freelance and I kept my lobby pass through a rather strange deal with Tribune, had a spare one so I could still go into Parliament. But I'm now working, and this is the modern age, I'm now working I've got a retainer with Byline Times, which is a modern internet-based, and you also just produce 1 paper a month. This is a completely different audience. It's a 21st century audience. Byline Times survives because someone is at the moment backing it. 2, they run, which is a very interesting thing for journalism and independent mind, they run a pop festival in Ashdown Forest, which is a nice place in Sussex, every year that combines them in the evening having various groups, and they also have controversial groups, like they have the people Putin hates there, the Dolls group, with serious discussions about independent journalism and about independent issues. So they have we've had really serious stuff. They've had one session about the whole issue of child sex abuse one year, and this year I went down and chaired one on the plight, believe it or not, to a younger audience of 50s women, the WASPy women. And they basically have great debates, and Brexit comes up and all sorts of things like this. But it's to a much more youthful audience who follow the stuff online. And actually what Byline Times has said, well, there seem to be a lot of Whitehall scandals going on. Why don't you write for us and start carrying some force? So Meg Hillier is now known to Byline Times, as well as the Times and the Guardian and other. But this is a huge area. Shows you how things have changed, because I've got my own blog, and I actually took up the case of him. This year, I have had nearly 1 million hits on it, this is for a single-handed blog. Something like Byline Times gets thousands of hits. And what is interesting is the message about you being independent is getting over. And I'll give one example. I did a story, very recent report, on the complete scandal of all these colleges, the university tech colleges, which I just presented. And we look back, and what I tend to do is, and this is really useful for a journalist and important, I go back, well, which minister was responsible? Then you find it's Michael Gove, and then box office goes up, and obviously because everyone's heard of Michael Gove, they might not have heard of university tech colleges. And basically, we did a report on this, and actually I followed it right through. I even discovered one college, I think the NAO missed out because you got 58, but by doing a check locally in the press, I discovered there was one in Derbyshire, or Burton-on-Trent, that actually doesn't appear in your list because they spent 8 million building it, and no students came. So it was just, it never opened, it never existed. Which was a real scam. I mean, there are about 10 from Hackney to Wigan and other places that are proposed. But then I watched the Twitter feed on it, and there was one hit which gives you an idea how much there's interest. This is from Byline Times. It's someone that spotted it and put no leak, not a leak, not spin, pure fact. That was retweeted 2,500 times, which actually shows you the interest. And the key thing they had picked up on it was this wasn't a story about some politician claiming this, that and the other. I'm not being rude, but you know, I mean, they do it one way or the other, or a party political row. This was a story of basically the people read and thought, my God, all that money was wasted. And today I did a story on the extraordinary thing about the Tory. It was, I know the NAO didn't plan this, but it was brilliant to bring out a report about failed manifesto pledges on the week, on the day that the first National Party launches. And this story about there wasn't a single starter home built anywhere, but they promised in the 2015 manifesto there'd be 200,000. In fact, if the policy had worked, Boris Johnson would be going out in the election campaign and shaking his hands with 175,000 under 40-year-old having a home. And again, this has immediately led to tweets. People are saying, well, what's happened to this money then? Why didn't they do this? And it's a debate then starts on Twitter about it. And it's a really interesting phenomenon because it's bypassing the official media. I mean, I'm sure you all pay, Masha and I was a member of the official media, and it was before actually the internet. It was key to everything. Now there's this completely new audience, and I have a feeling that the reason why, without being two-party political, why all the polls said, you know, that the last election, Jeremy Corbyn was finished, and Lord Ashcroft rather famously, on the eve of the poll, the great Tory, who's a great Tory peer and a right-winger and a Brexiteer, up the government's majority for the Tories under Theresa May from 50 seats to 90, 2 hours before the polls closed. And actually, suddenly people realised that actually it didn't matter if the Daily Mail did 14 pages saying that Jeremy Corbyn is an IRA terrorist and murders people at night in North Islington, because nobody read it. Nobody under 40 was reading papers regularly anymore. And it might be quite a big difference with Europe. I mean, Europe, it may still be the same, but here we notice this a lot. The other key thing I might say about the National Audit Office that I found really useful as a journalist to sort of do was I had one project with Biling Times. They said, simple question, how much is Chris Grayling? Chris Grayling is basically the opposite of Croesus, actually. Everything he touches seems to collapse in a disaster. And they said, we think he probably is the minister in Britain who's been in charge of projects that's wasted the most money of all time. And basically, they said, well, can you add it all up? And I was able to then do an audit trail of his waste of money through the National Audit Office reports. Because if you went back to 2010 and 11 when I was in, they did a report on, there were riots in London at the time, and they had this strange scheme, I think it was the DWP, Work and Pension, or what was the predecessor ministry, to decide that one way to deal with all these kids was to force them to go and take jobs where they were training, which might be in a great theory a good idea. But what happened was that he and Boris Johnson, who was then Mayor of London, together decided to spend money on this scheme and order people to work for nothing for charities and other things. And what happened was they didn't do it. And it was a total disaster. They found they had a huge number of people left after 8 weeks. Some of it may have perversely made them look for a job for themselves. But actually, the system, which was supposed to help a load of embittered teenagers and others actually do something, didn't work at all. In fact, they resented being ordered to work in charity shops and other things and just walked off. And there was a great internal report by the DWP admitting the failure and also saying we will wipe off some money. Similarly, when I followed it right the way up to the railways, He has extraordinary. This man has gone through a series of ministries, and in each ministry there's been a disaster, and there was a disaster. That was a small one. One of the biggest disasters was the privatisation of the probation service, which was run really badly and has ended up actually with a lot of heartache. I mean, it's not only money that's been lost, but people like people who have suffered domestic abuse. They were so incompetent, some of these private firms. They went and let out people who had abused someone next door or near down the road from them, when in fact the proper probation service would have actually probably picked this up. So that was a huge waste when it's now having to be cut back and be put back into the system, really, in the state system. Then there was the railways with various contracts, and the worst one, where I got 2 billion of it, was the London North Eastern Railway has now gone back from being run by, I think it was Stagecoach and Virgin, to public ownership, because they just handed it back with and basically when you looked at the bill, all they'd done was taken the subsidy to start and returned none of the profit. All this you can trace, and I knew I could write this story accurately because the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee had actually provided facts that I knew I was safe in running, actually, because they had been properly researched and that we weren't just making up figures or relying on things. And that, I think, is really important. This is one of the really important roles you have with the media. It allows the media to actually get sort of factual stories. The tragedy is with the media, if I'm totally frank, is that they're no longer, at the time I was in Britain, people stayed on The Guardian for a long time. Now, actually, it doesn't happen anymore. There's a massive turnover of journalism in the lobby, with people going to new things. So there isn't, when you talked about, knowing the history of, institutional history of the press, it isn't there anymore so much. And a lot of the press some of the journalists don't know anything about the past history. The other thing I say that has really damaged the situation, I don't want to criticise the NAO particularly over this because I don't think it's their fault, was the abolition of the Audit Commission. The Audit Commission did for local government what central government, what the NAO does for central government by monitoring and keeping in line everything from a tiny parish council to actually quite large multi-million pound authorities. What I suspect is happening is that people have realised there's no proper monitoring on and now think they can get away with it. Why do I think this? It's because I've actually do get people contact me on my website, and one of the most highest levels are people suggesting corruption in local government or dodgy things, whether it's Kent. And I've got one, I don't know whether I better name the town, but 2 people in one town have spent 10 years investigating what could be an absolute mega scandal. There is one town in Britain, a historic small town that would now be the equivalent of a parish, but at the time was a borough of its own rights, that owned a lot of buildings, and actually it goes right back to George IV, and it's on the coast, and about basically having to raise money to prevent harbours silting up, and they had to raise all the time, so they owned a lot of property. There is a suggestion, and we are trying to, I've used an FOI to get hold of the entire council minutes from 56 to 71, so it's a historic story, this. And what we've discovered is that swathes of the minutes have been removed, and the allegation is that there has been a really large-scale fraud, that when the property was transferred to, actually it had been the unitary authority that took over this, well, it would actually be the county government and the unitary authority, it disappeared. And there is some suggestion that the property actually went to a load of individuals, just like that. And what they've done in the minutes, and I'm only at the early stage, I thought I'd just mention this, it gives you a real idea about investigating facts, and is that their pages torn out of this, their minutes. They are missing things, and we're trying to work out, and there's some quite expensive building. There's also an estate as well. And what I mean is this sort of thing, I think I know what I would do immediately with these. I would have taken them to the Audit Commission and said, here's the research they've done, why is this missing? And I think the Audit Commission, probably with far more authority than me, would have investigated this. And if these people had got away with what amounts to a major fraud and an incredibly self-enrichment, and the people have tried their damnedest. They've even talked to solicitors, to the people, and the solicitors don't want to know. It's amazing who doesn't want to know about this. So I just mentioned this. There is, I think, a huge gap, and I think it should be restored. And if I hope after the election, and whoever gets in, someone can be persuaded to, because otherwise I think local government will become an area where people think they can do anything they like because no one is keeping an idea. And that is the great value of the National Audit Office in a healthy, independent democracy. That people can come to a body that is not part of government, that actually can look at it. In fact, we passed byline passed it because someone came, a public whistleblower, who spent 2 years and has now resigned from a body set up to, I don't know, check whether people are, the Chinese or something, are importing below cost stuff to Roomba. It was done by the EU at the moment. And spent 2 years. they spent $2.5 million on consultants and Deloitte, paying for European bureaucrats to come over here and tell people how to do what they were already doing, which is perfectly okay for Britain. And then they were told, she claims, not to tell the HMRC, not to tell anybody what they were doing. And they were all sitting around, and it may have cost quite a few million quid, actually doing nothing for 2 years, except having meetings about what they might do. And that is the sort of thing that I think actually is absolutely invaluable. And it's for journalists like myself who like digging into things. I actually find if you didn't exist, my job would be very difficult. So I will thank you for that and stop and ask if any questions.